On the verge of the extinction of humanity due to the appearance of monsters, a mage appeared to save his race from all this chaos. He in particular used magic that came at the cost of his own life force, called dark magic. With his blood, he could summon an army of the undead. And in the end, this type of dark magic was used to save humanity from the very darkness. Amidst that crisis, he was the one responsible for saving everyone, but his end was actually quite tragic. Even so, before his death, the hero left one final sentence, and paraphrasing the mage, what he said was that his curse would change this world. However, after the hero was gone, the world entered an era of peace like never before. Then 100 years later, in the village of Floss, the morning rain falls over blooming sunflowers. And meanwhile, the protagonist of our story asks what Violet is doing at his house. The girl replies that she's just carrying the flowers. But anyway, what the boy really wanted to know was why she was watering his face. Sometime later in that same village, while children played and people walked alongside extraordinary beings. In a certain bar, this blonde boy was ordering something to eat while everyone stopped what they were doing just to admire him. With little waiting time, the tavern owner delivers the order, and when asked if it suits Lord Lewis' taste, he replies that it does. By the way, the waiter asks if the protagonist heard the rumor that the next village is having problems due to an epidemic, and the bald employee thinks that maybe that's why his friend hasn't been able to contact him. Therefore, what comes to the waiter's mind is that this can only be the effect of the hero's curse, which Lewis disagrees with. Even so, the bald man comments that this place feels quite different from usual. That's what he calls the epidemic of love because of Lord Lewis' presence there. Lewis in turn feels uncomfortable, so the bald man starts to leave while apologizing. Thus, the protagonist can finally be alone and enjoy his meal. But as always, peace lasts little and the hero is interrupted by an elf who asks if the boy is with someone. With a smile, she explains that it's nothing important, but makes it clear that a girl from her guild said she likes him. And this girl in particular had never said that to anyone before. Because of that, the elf asks if Lewis is interested in going out with the group for a drink or something to eat. However, unexpectedly, the protagonist asks how much he will be paid for it. He reveals that he gets paid to eat there, so he asks again how much he will be paid. And with a charming expression, he questions if the girl has ever stopped to think how difficult these situations are for him. Despite all the arrogance, this angelic atmosphere creates a pleasurable kind of rejection. And inevitably, it is the elf who feels bad for even considering talking to someone so distant from her reality. That's why she doesn't think twice before running away. Then the protagonist goes back to eating while wondering if he's being too mean. Unfortunately, he believes he has no choice since giving space for others' feelings to grow has already caused some problems in the past. However, deep down, Lewis still really enjoys the feeling of being adored for his beauty. All the time, people want to know where he's going, what he's eating, and obviously what clothes he's choosing to wear each day. They want to follow everything the boy does like a true influencer. Naturally, all this obsession leads people to humiliate themselves for even the smallest of interactions, like the case of a guy who knelt down and cried just to shake his hand. In the end, this is indeed quite an interesting life for the boy. Suddenly, that same girl from earlier greets the protagonist, asking if his nickname really is God of Beauty. She confesses that she found out Lewis had done some stupid things like refusing an invitation to the Imperial City because of his appearance. However, in her view, that only made him even more interesting. Anyway, the girl asks to forget what happened before and have a friendly conversation, but the protagonist asks who she is. And in case she also wants a handshake, Lewis asks her to come back another time since that's something stressful. The girl trembles with rage, thinking that she won't forget this, and starts laughing uncontrollably. However, soon the hatred grows stronger, making her draw her sword. She screams, calling the boy trash and asking if he really wants to die. But at that moment, an enormous fan steps in front of her, saying that the only one who can touch Lewis is her, which quickly intimidates the adventurer. Thus, this monstrous fan orders them not to mess with her love and disperses the group. However, as the protagonist walks away, the adventurer holds onto this hatred along with the conviction that if she can't have him, no one else will. Sometime later, already during the night, two mysterious people approach the boy's house. They look through the window, and although they admit that Lewis is handsome, they still think they are better, which is obviously an illusion, but changing the subject, these two ask if they'll get a date if they kill him. And the adventurer from before has to agree, even though it's a lie. The elf in turn asks if they really have to go that far, and then the other girl in the group agrees. However, the leader just bumps into the two of them, telling them to get out of the way since she is already determined to destroy Lewis if she can't have him. Anyway, she turns around smiling, telling them to finish it quickly. But she despairs because she sees the pawns defeated on the ground, and right when she hears a noise behind her, her companions end up in the same condition. Finally, the one responsible for this appears at the adventurer's flanks with a knife, asking if she is the mastermind. With her heart pounding, the girl is impressed by this person's speed. And with someone like that being there, she asks about her identity until she despairs even more upon realizing she is facing Violet. In a very deceitful manner, the adventurer asks why she is being threatened. Then Lewis' bodyguard throws the intruder backward and warns her with a very unfriendly expression that flowers are made only to be looked at. Therefore, it is unforgivable that someone like her tried to pick one from the ground. Anyway, Violet advises that the adventurer should just look in her next life. This is followed by a scream, but since it's something routine, it doesn't even wake Lewis. A few hours later, morning arrives in the city like every other day, and when the protagonist leaves the house, he greets Violet. Anyway, he calls her attention by asking if she hadn't already watered the flowers the day before. Then the girl decides to give the excuse that they were almost dry the previous night. By the way, Violet asks when the boy will go down to the village because they will run out of money. And since he's bored, she suggests that he works as a hobby, but Lewis refuses, since he only wants to live a peaceful life without worrying about anything else. In the end, he thought his life would just be a sea of fun, but a month later, something happened. He really regretted going down to the village, even if only for a short time. It really could have been that epidemic the restaurant owner mentioned earlier. And being a normal person, the protagonist couldn't help but get infected too. Violet, in turn, stayed by the boy's bedside the whole time, crying over his condition. However, Lewis wasn't completely sad since he would die at his peak and with many good experiences. At least that was what he was trying to convince himself, because at the last second, he cried, confessing that he didn't want to go. And so with Violet screaming beside him in concern while telling him to open his eyes, Lewis passed away. However, after some time, a skill called Death Resistance from the Descendant of Dark Magic was activated. And so on an ordinary night, the protagonist woke up in a forest, still wondering if he was dreaming. Unbelievably, he really thought it had all just been a nightmare. He simply decided to check his handsome face after such a good sleep. But his eyes looked deeper and his face paler than before. So after a few seconds of reflection, Lewis wondered what this could be. And when he realized he had turned into a horrifying skeleton, he obviously fell to his knees on the ground. A level 1 skeleton soldier with the title of Bastard and minimal stats. In some distant place, 486 rank and knights participated in an expedition to conquer a dungeon. However, in the end, 100% of them were annihilated by the dangers of the place. That's because the boss of this dungeon was one that even rank S adventurers would have difficulty facing. It was the Lord of Shadows and Black Dragon called Atrox. At least that's what a wandering knight heard about that fateful day. However, unexpectedly, when Lewis encountered this beast, it fell in love with the boy. And when the protagonist asked if it liked him that much, the confirming answer was more than clear. To the soldier's surprise, the black dragon was even rolling on its back. So seeing that, another adventurer commented that the boy was really worth every penny. The guild leader thought it was impossible, but Unit Dragon had fallen for Lewis' charms, and in his 30 years as a hunter, he had never seen anything like it before. The leader in turn knew that even the highest level magic wouldn't be able to subjugate that dragon, so it became clear that what was happening was something nobler and more powerful than magic. This was the effect of having overwhelming beauty, and since it was happening solely because of appearance, it ended up being a bit discouraging for the warriors. Indeed, being handsome is a huge advantage, and to receive the salary of an S-class mercenary, all the boy needed to do was show his face. With that appearance, he could easily enjoy wealth and honor at any moment. Therefore, now our hero reflects on everything he has lost, feeling quite depressed. Suddenly, a group of goblins appears, and the leader asks who the skeleton thinks he is to enter their area. Besides that, he states that the skeleton looks hideous, and then spits right in the middle of Lewis' forehead. Naturally, the protagonist runs away in despair while thinking that something like this must be a dream. There shouldn't be a goblin there, as they are only found in dungeons. But at that moment, the protagonist stops running because he remembers that this is not behavior worthy of the great Lewis. That's why he declares that he won't give up over something like this and turns around, saying that he will survive somehow. However, just when he thought dealing with one or two should be easy, he gets struck on the skull by one of the monsters' clubs. Thus, a hole is created in his skull, and while being beaten, the protagonist remembers that, in truth, he never had a fight in his life. In the end, the great Lewis was treated like this by mere goblins. In the past, the protagonist encountered these monsters once but kept a confident expression and intimidated them. After all, they were nothing more than simple, low-level monsters. That was how he lived, but in his new life, the reality was being trampled by these little monsters. That is, until suddenly, a projectile came at high speed and hit the aggressor. Then, a human in knight's armor jumped on the second one and finished it off as well. Meanwhile, Lewis remained lying on the ground completely still. Luckily, in the eyes of these adventurers, they believed he was the remains of a human eaten by monsters. Therefore, the cleric made a prayer, but the truth was that the boy simply couldn't get up because he couldn't move. At a certain moment, the hero stands up and thanks them for their help. Then, because of his past life, he offers a meal together as a reward. But his appearance is terrifying and his head is knocked off in an instant. After all, the adventurers immediately thought that a talking skeleton must be a demon. Between monsters and people, Lewis was now trying to understand how he ended up there, and in any case, he decided to go home. A little closer to the evening, the boy arrives at the village, but the situation is different from before. Maybe because of the plague or because it's a dream, everything is destroyed, but it still doesn't make sense that the flowers are withering. Anyway, Violet's house looks the same, so the boy decides to go there to take a closer look. Unexpectedly, the place is open. Judging by the bottles on the floor, Lewis believes they aren't Violet's since she doesn't drink. Anyway, speaking of her, as soon as she sees an invading skeleton, the girl thrusts her sword into the monster. Indeed, for some reason, it was her who drank all those bottles. And while the protagonist received a kick to the face, he thought that she was a complete mess. Inevitably, he was thrown against the wall and his skeletal arm was torn off and thrown far away. For some reason, she had gotten very upset while he was away. Even so, the protagonist asks the girl to wait while she approaches. Suddenly, Violet disappears and reappears behind the boy, questioning his identity. To her, the fact that a monster could act like a human and pretend to know her was very strange. Then, without even thinking, the protagonist replied that he was Louis, which definitely struck her. The truth is that he also didn't know why he had become a skeleton. However, at that moment, he was slammed to the ground brutally by his former companion, which made him feel a lot of pain. Then the girl grabs the skeleton's skull and prepares an attack to finish him off once and for all. Violet gets angrier than ever before because a monster is trying to imitate someone she knows. But the protagonist insists the whole time that he is telling the truth. Inevitably, the knife gets closer and Louis' second death seems imminent. However, right in the instant before his death, he screams about the flowers. In the past, the girl's most common hobby was watering the plants and sometimes Louis. One day, the protagonist asked why she kept calling him Flowers, and in response, she said that Louis was as beautiful as a flower, so inevitably, he had to accept that it wasn't such a bad nickname. Back to the present, suddenly a few drops of water fall on the boy's face, followed by the knife falling next to him. That's because upon hearing that declaration, the girl starts crying. Practically overwhelmed by her emotions, she asks if it's really Louis there, until she hugs him, revealing that she missed him very much. Sometime later, already at dawn, the girl explains that Louis had been dead for a year and that a lot had happened, to his surprise. Anyway, the protagonist asks why they are sitting back to back. Then Violet replies that she's still getting used to this, which makes Louis feel left out. Anyway, the girl reveals that a demon appeared, making him focus on that. It was said that a war broke out because of the demons and that some kingdoms were already wiped out. However, she couldn't leave this place full of memories. In a general summary, that's what happened until he showed up, and that's why there were goblins nearby. After thinking a bit about everything, the protagonist calls the girl and asks if there's a chance to return to how things once were. Then unexpectedly, she asks him not to worry quite cheerfully, saying she knows a way to make Louis get his original face back. So sometime later, the two met at the top of the mountain next to the cabin. Louis was determined to do whatever it took to return to his previous body. And during this journey, Violet could be in danger, so he asked if she would still follow him. Without even having to think much, the girl replied yes, since her job was watering flowers. With nothing more to discuss there, the journey of the two to recover Louis' beauty began. In this world, there is a regeneration potion that rebuilds all flesh in an instant, and to make it, you need to gather red spider legs, the tail of a blue lizard, and a bit of green deer blood. And finally, the last ingredient needed is what's in front of the protagonist, the master of the lake called Leviathan. Therefore, the hero calls it to battle without any kind of fear. Obviously, the monster gets irritated by the boldness of this ugly bastard. And more than that, it gets worried because the skeleton seems like someone who could be broken at any moment. Therefore, the Leviathan hesitates, wondering if there's some plan behind this. Louis then asks if the monster is scared with a sarcastic smile. And finally, the master of the lake is consumed by fury and charges after Louis as expected. Thus, after a short time running, he shouts for Violet to appear. At the moment the command is given, the girl appears above the monster with her knives ready to stab. The Leviathan, in turn, only has time to realize how manipulated it was before it meets its end with an attack. Shortly after, the companions gather with all the ingredients already placed in the flask. Now the regeneration potion, which was an item blessed by an angel, had been made. And unbelievably, it only worked in a place where cherry blossoms were blooming. Without wasting time, the hero decides to test it, but the girl quickly stops him. To make sure there's no mistake, she makes a small cut on her hand and explains that she will test it on herself first. So, just a drop of the potion, an incandescent light appears along with the descent of a true angel who blesses the girl's hand, to the protagonist's surprise. In that case, now Violet hands the potion to her companion to test, which makes him quite reflective. He understands that he needs to say something and calls the girl. And perhaps for the first time he admits that without her, he would be nothing, so he thanks her from the bottom of his heart. Louis breaks the seal of the potion and lifts it above his head. For him now, all this suffering of being ugly would be over. All the suffering of a pathetic life he lived, even if only for a short time. Thus, Louis also cries while breaking the container because if he could go back to the past, he wouldn't have been as petty as he was. The effects start to take hold in the protagonist, but unexpectedly, his arm dissolves on the ground as if it had been exposed to acid, leaving Violet very worried. It's natural that Louis doesn't understand what's happening, so some more time passes until everything becomes clear. After that, Violet doesn't even know what to say because the protagonist simply won't stop banging his head against the ground, even though she's asking him to calm down. Louis, in turn, questions whether he should really calm down since there's no way that can happen when he can't return to normal. He asks if he really has to live like this forever if he can't regenerate. Then Louis screams, questioning if he truly did something wrong, and loses his strength upon realizing he won't be able to return. In that case, he also believes there's no reason to live and considers simply ending all right there. Naturally, Violet feels terrible for not being able to help her companion, and she tries to convince him that there is another way. But the conversation is interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious being who raises dust with an explosion. Because of that, Violet quickly stands in front of the boy to protect him and tells him to run as fast as possible. That's because what's in front of them has a horn, red hair, red eyes, and sharp teeth. Therefore, with that aura, there's no doubt for her that this being is the true demon queen. Once again, Violet asks the boy to try to run, saying she will buy some time. However, what the protagonist does is ask for a favor since, as the demon queen, she must be very strong. And what he asks is for her to put an end to this pathetic life. For the demon, being asked to be exterminated when someone is already dead is quite interesting. But the most curious thing was that at this moment, the boy was in a state of half alive, half dead. Anyway, she states that she will fulfill his wish, and Lewis readily accepts his fate. Because in his mind, if he can't go back, it's better to end this way. However, Violet was someone who would never let her companion do something like that. And without even consulting Lewis about his wishes, she simply pushed him away. Then, with a smile, she asked him to stay alive and not forget that even now there are still people who wish to protect him. In this way, Violet stands face to face with the demon, and a clash between the two is imminent. Soon the girl moves quickly, making fast slashes against the demon queen's carcass. And even though it was something superficial, it actually hurts her, making her stomp on the ground forcefully. After thinking better while looking at her wound, her face breaks into a sincere laugh that soon turns into a desperate cackle. Since she was wounded, the demon agrees to deal with the girl properly and activates the Eye of Lucifer. Thus, her combat power increases along with her speed, making even Violet notice it. At first, she intended to defend herself, but her knife was broken in half, because the eyes of Lucifer can see through essence, making blocks useless. Even so, the girl attacked again and once more managed to wound the demon, making her even more interested. The queen responded with a strike meant to be unexpected, and for the first time, an opponent not only dodged, but also counterattacked. Because of this, the demon's level of admiration for Violet reaches the point of offering her a spot by her side. She really can't understand why a human so strong would risk herself for a skeleton. Then Violet explained with a smile that she made a promise to water flowers, and that a demon obsessed with killing could never understand the feeling of losing something precious. Unexpectedly, even the queen had something like that hidden away, and being reminded of it deeply irritated her. When everything seemed lost for Violet, a voice shouted no. That's because, once again, Lord Lewis decided to throw himself into this danger. Obviously, Violet questions him, but the protagonist is convinced that he has nothing left to lose. The demon in turn starts being disturbed by a light that won't stop coming. But when she analyzes it better, she realizes the truth because of her Eye of Lucifer. The person she was seeing wasn't that skeleton, but Lewis himself. Some time ago in the Demon Queen's castle, a demon screamed that it was impossible. It was absurd to believe they were actually seeking peace. Because of that, a superior duck from the gossipers appeared asking the reason for the commotion. Thus, it was explained that he didn't understand why the queen wasn't attacking humans since he had been monitoring through the crystal orb. Inevitably, the duck immediately understood what it was about. To clarify, he explained that the queen had fallen in love with a human. And since the demon soldier didn't believe it, it was shown that in every corner of the castle, there was something related to Lewis. The demon asked if it was magic, but that only irritated the duck. Finally, he explained that in his homeland, this kind of behavior was called a fandom. Because of that, back to the present, the queen runs desperately and throws herself on top of the protagonist, crying her eyes out as she explains how much she missed him, while Lewis naturally is left speechless. Until now, even after hundreds of years, there have only been 10 demon kings, and among them, the greatest of all was the queen known as the Black Dragon, Atrox. As long as the Black Dragon existed, it was only a matter of time before humanity was completely destroyed. That's what they used to say, but now she was crying out of longing in the protagonist's arms like a child. Sometime after the reunion, Atrox is updated about what happened. However, she finds it horrible that the boy has reappeared in the form of such an unpleasant skeleton. Anyway, since he said he was searching for his body, Atrox tells him not to worry, because she will definitely help him on this journey to recover his lost beauty. Violet, on the other hand, screams at the boy not to trust her since she's a demon. But the protagonist stops her and simply asks if Atrox really wants to help him. Then the demon replies yes, because there are all kinds of dangers spread across the human world. And to her, the girl next to the protagonist is too weak to protect him. Feeling attacked, Violet states that she is the one who protects the flowers there and that in exchange Lewis will protect her. However, this statement fills the queen with rage. In this case, she screams, questioning why Violet let Lewis die a year ago, silencing her. In any case, the demon knows it's still difficult for the protagonist to trust her. So blushing with embarrassment, she suggests that the two sign a servant and master contract, which, although the protagonist doesn't understand, Violet does and gets deeply irritated. Anyway, some time passes, and soon, while a rabbit eats a carrot peacefully, an explosion sends it flying away. This was the result of the demon contract, where with the penalty of soul annihilation, Atrox committed to helping Lewis until he recovered his beauty. Now that everything was settled, the demon said she would do her best. And since she hadn't introduced herself before, she explained that she was the Black Dragon Atrox. Lewis, in turn, surprises her by saying that it's hard to call her by that name. So since she's a demon, but also kind and also a dragon, he decides to give her the name Little Dragon. Dragons have their names passed down from family heritage through generations. That's why being called Little Good Dragon or Little Dragon is something that affects the queen. But it affects her positively because she thinks it's a very cute nickname. So the girl jumps with joy, saying that Lewis is the best. Now they need to think about where they'll move next. And without showing the discussion, sometime later in a desert, Violet informs that they are almost at the village. The protagonist, even as a skeleton, is melting from the heat. And when asked about his condition, he states that he is not okay. Anyway, Violet asks if the boy feels comfortable having Atrox by his side. After all, demons are a race that kills humans for fun. But in this case, she was just feeling hot. Then the hero responds to these concerns with a flick on her forehead. Lewis states that he doesn't care whether it's a human or a demon as long as they want to help him with his goal. The protagonist says that ever since he became a skeleton, each day has been hell, so he asks Violet not to worry so much. After all, she's also there to help him. Faced with that, Violet starts thinking that she acted wrongly, and if she doesn't believe in him, no one will. So the girl gets excited thinking she's important. Not long ago, that comment from the demon about having let Lewis die really shook her. So the girl is determined not to let the same thing happen and is set on protecting Lewis just like she protects the flowers. A few hours later, in a city near the region called Arcanus, the group enters the place through a cave that leads underground. Down below, it's common to see both needy people and dangerous ones frequently, but the protagonist remains cheerful. Seeing this, Violet warns that this is a very dangerous place. But since the girl knows this and still brought the hero there, Atrox calls her pathetic. Anyway, she throws herself on the boy, saying that she will protect him. And with a shout, Violet states that she came only to get clues about the location of the hero's body. Therefore, Lewis praises Violet, leaving Atrox behind while asking about the plan. And because of that, Violet turns just to glare at the queen with a mocking expression, which makes her furious. In this way, Atrox screams, calling the girl for a fight, but only receives more disdain. After a few more hours in some random cabin, the protagonist asks to rest. And since there are only 2 rooms, Atrox doesn't even think before following the hero to his room. Logically, the hero is confused to see the girl there. But when he asked about it, she makes a cute face, saying they'll have to share the room since there are only 2. Thus, Violet rushes at her, questioning why she's trying to deceive him. However, in an instant, Atrox appears behind the girl, saying that she will stay with Lewis. This makes the 2 start fighting over the spot in the boy's room while he sighs in exhaustion. In the end, the ones who've had to share the room are the 2 rivals. Atrox can barely stand her roommate's face and starts cursing a lot. Then Violet warns that swearing is rude, but for an originally evil demon, something like that was no big deal. Anyway, if it weren't for her, Atrox could have slept with Lewis, but Violet says that as long as she's there, she won't let that happen. Thus, the demon asks if, by any chance, the girl asks for her permission, but in response, the hero's companion states that she doesn't care about any of that. Then finally, after so much threatening, they start fighting again. In between punches and kicks, a final blow from both clashes, generating a devastating pressure in that cabin room. Both are injured, and Atrox is as excited as the first time they fought. But obviously, a place like that wouldn't withstand their strength. That's why the whole structure started to break. However, what they didn't expect was that they would also destroy the wall of another room, revealing a couple in their moment of fun. For Atrox, this was amusing while Violet closed her eyes, but only until she noticed a hole in the wall of the protagonist's room as well. Quickly, the 2 entered the place to ask if the boy was okay. Since he wasn't there, Atrox suggested that he might be out for a walk nearby. But soon that idea changed because there was one of the boy's belongings on the bed, and there was also a skeleton leg found by Violet. Naturally, the hero wasn't the type to go for a walk without his leg. Therefore, the only possible explanation for his disappearance was that Lord Lewis had been kidnapped. Right after that conclusion was reached, somewhere a little far away, a wagon carried our hero among the luggage. And in that same region, people were passing by at high speed. Atrox, who is searching for Lewis along with Violet, asks if the girl knows where he is. Then fortunately, the girl says yes and points to the central auction house of the city that's right ahead. By auction house, it means a place that trades not only goods but everything. Naturally, no one asks or tries to find out where and how the auction items were acquired, since whether someone stole or extorted isn't something that matters. As long as it brings money, they auction anything they can find. So even the protagonist could be auctioned despite his appearance not seeming very useful. Violet states that the world is full of crazy people in ways beyond imagination, and that even ends up being a contradiction since she's traveling with a demon. Anyway, suddenly an arrow approaches, passing by Atrox, and Violet barely manages to catch it. Then, with her hands injured, she asks who is behind this. With no other choice, 2 guys are surprised that the girl managed to catch the projectile from so close. But X and Tra, Class D, agree that Violet is totally her type. Because of this, they get into a bit of a conflict for competing over the same girl. And since all eyes are on Violet, the queen feels left out. Anyway, one of the twins remembers that his mother had told them not to fight over women. Therefore, the crazy conclusion the 2 come to is that they should kill her. Thus, they introduce themselves as the twins X and Tra, but right when they tell the girl to remember their names, they are both brutally defeated. With that, Violet calls Aatrox to continue the search. Before that, the demon believes they should at least interrogate them. But Violet remembers how they wouldn't stop talking, and after thinking for a bit, Aatrox agrees to leave them. Shortly after, at the Arcanus auction house, the presenter prepares to reveal the next item, which is a belonging of Herp. Known for being a dragon slayer, his shorts are up for auction. Since the hero used only one pair of shorts during his adventures, they represent the hardships he faced. And when the bids were placed, someone managed to take it home for 25 gold coins. With the preliminary items finished, the audience had already been waiting for a long time, so the main item was brought to the stage. It revealed itself as a portrait painting of the protagonist called the Attractive Evil. It was said that in his time, Lewis was the most handsome man on Earth, with perfection blessed by God. Even monsters would fall in love with him, and even though his personality was that of a criminal, that was part of his charm. However, the presenter stated that it was still too early to be shocked, because for the buyer of this portrait, Lewis's skeleton would also be given along with it. Logically, he began a speech to convince the audience that this was real. However, the presenter himself didn't believe it, as he had brought it simply because he was idle in the city. Either way, he knew it was impossible to verify the legitimacy of the skeleton, so he simply asked the buyers to trust him, offering his personal guarantee. Whether it was true or not, something like this excited the auction house whenever it was displayed, because even though he was dead, the possibility of it being Lewis generated great interest as it was a unique edition. Therefore, for the special edition, it was announced that the starting price would be 100 gold coins. However, even though it was a high price, it didn't take long for someone to offer 500. And as everyone became interested, the price surpassed 700, reaching 800. The presenter then became very scared and asked if anyone would offer more. To his surprise, someone did, leaving him euphoric because 1,000 gold coins would be the highest price in the history of that auction house. But to frustrate the protagonist's commerce, the gates were blown up, leaving the presenter confused, not understanding what was happening. And so the girls entered the place with Aatrox cursing the responsible ones and Violet, telling her to be polite. Then the demon girl screamed, reminding everyone that she was the personification of evil. But regardless, the focus shifted to the stage where the protagonist was hanging. Without thinking twice, Aatrox charged at high speed, and a higher-ranked guard tried to stop her. But as the Queen of Demons, she broke his weapon. Right after, another soldier of the huge club jumped over, but this time Violet joined the fight, interrupting him, and generating such a strong impact that the energy inside the weapon collapsed, causing an explosion. Faced with this, the magnates at the event hoped the two had been eliminated. However, after the smoke cleared, Aatrox appeared, saying that despite being strong, these humans were no match for her. But although that was the case for her, she was worried because Violet had been badly injured trying to defend herself. Anyway, the girl asked them to focus on saving the protagonist, and more than anything, she asked the queen not to let her guard down. There in that hall were countless nobles and wealthy people who had come to buy goods. Therefore, it also meant that there were many powerful guards escorting them for protection. Thus, if the demon queen truly cared about the protagonist, Violet asked for her help, and apparently, Aatrox agreed. However, she decided to slightly change the rules of that deal, asking for Violet to be the one to help her instead. After all, as the Queen of Demons, she believed she was the only one capable of protecting Lewis. Thus, Violet had no choice but to accept. But since both were working toward the same goal, it didn't matter who helped whom. An explosion occurred when Aatrox jumped into the middle of the auction participants, and Violet slashed everyone she could with her knives. That was until, suddenly, a magic circle formed above the girl, and from that circle, a very powerful lightning spell was summoned, which was a source of pride for the responsible mage. Fortunately, it didn't cause much damage because Aatrox managed to interfere, protecting her companion with her wings. No longer able to stand all this chaos, the presenter screamed, questioning what the thieves wanted. In truth, he already knew what they were after. He knew the two were after Lewis, who was the main item of that auction. But with a hammer in hand, the man declared that if this item were to bring danger to his precious clients, that he would destroy it with his own hands. And just as he said he would, he did, sending the bones flying with an acting performance worthy of a true actor. Had the presenter simply run away, his clients would never return to do business again. But now that he had pretended to sacrifice an extremely valuable item for the greater good, everyone was impressed. As for the portrait, he had already stored it elsewhere, but the skeleton was just something he had obtained randomly. That was what the auctioneer believed because Aatrox didn't stop advancing even with that decision. Suddenly, the sky began to close with a red moon at the center of it all. An earthquake also struck the land, leaving everyone very scared. Aatrox had promised that she would bring the protagonist back, but was far too arrogant. Either way, it was a fact that now all those responsible for this would be exterminated. With Aatrox's fury, a manifestation of bloody red energy rose to the sky, and outside the auction, a puddle of number 2 was on the ground. Because Gyrex, who was the imperial guard of the Felton family known as Storm, was unlucky enough to be assigned there and naturally couldn't stay brave. Initially, Gyrex believed that he would be the protagonist because even though he was born poor, he had overwhelming power. Therefore, despite being poor, having magical abilities allowed him to enroll in the elite course at the magic school and rebuild his family. However, now in front of him, there was a power even more overwhelming than his. And Atrox, as the Queen of Demons, did not care at all about his life. Fortunately, at the last moment, the girl was stopped as Violet warned that at this rate, the building would collapse. Atrox in turn questioned whether the girl was calm about the hero's death. But regarding that, Violet informed her that, in fact, the protagonist was not dead and asked her colleague to take a closer look at Lewis's bones. It was said that after becoming a skeleton, the protagonist acquired the ability Ultra Regeneration, which is infinitely superior to healing magic. Thus, Atrox ceased fire since this meant that Lewis was still alive. However, while the presenter tried to sneak away, Violet reminded her that as long as they didn't bring the building down, they could at least punish the responsible party. The girl wasted no time taking down not only the auctioneer, but also all his guards. Because of this, that mage from before tried to attack with an electric spell, but Violet was far too irritated for not living up to the hero's trust. All the time, memories of her failures kept coming back to her mind. Therefore, Violet decided to relieve her anger in her own way until the protagonist regenerated, as a true assassin would do. Faced with this, Atrox was a little startled because her colleague was clearly human. However, she emitted an aura more sinister than that of a demon when fighting. That's why the queen considered that Violet hadn't shown everything she had in their previous fight. Indeed, Atrox found this berserk state frightening and admitted that she was not capable of surpassing her. Still, the fact that she was afraid of a human when she herself was the demon queen left her outraged. In the end, while she was about to be attacked from behind, she remembered that she was the most powerful black dragon. So she simply released a bit of her aura, sending all the cowards flying away. Even though the girl's second horn had not yet regenerated, she believed she had no choice and mentally asked Violet to watch her, because it would be her who would save the protagonist first by destroying all those bastards. Violet in turn really started paying attention to her colleague because even in the previous battle, as now, it was a fact that the queen did not dodge any attack except for fatal injuries. In this case, Violet became confused, wondering whether the demon wasn't afraid of death. She had sworn that she would risk her life for the protagonist, but she didn't know if she was as determined as Atrox. Either way, the host named Dapara, who had been dishonorably discharged from his service as a knight in the Empire for corruption, picked up a knife from the ground and advanced from behind, saying that the girl would pay for ruining his auction. Thus, a cut actually happened and the short man was very proud of his performance, but it was all for nothing since he was the one who fell. Violet then mentally thanked Atrox, offering her the merit of the strength she had to protect Lewis. Suddenly, the girl's attention was stolen because of an aura that began to go out of control beside her. This aura was coming from Atrox. Violet became worried that the queen couldn't control her powers since this way the area would be destroyed, which is exactly what happened. Anyway, sometime later, the protagonist woke up very frightened and the girls became excited to see him well. Lewis, for his part, seemed confused, and after looking around, asked if everything had been a dream because he felt like he was somewhere else. Then, very cleverly, the two pretended not to understand while handing him a glass of water. As the water fell to the ground because Lewis was a skeleton, he retorted, questioning why their faces looked like that, and inevitably asked if the two had fought again. Even though they tried to deny it, the hero couldn't think of anyone else who could have broken the wall. Because of that, Atrox admits that it was her who did it. However, she explains in her own way, saying that she couldn't control her own strength and that Violet tried to calm her down. When asked about it, the girl agrees, a little surprised. Later, while the two walk down the hallway, Atrox comments that she's feeling sleepy, but Violet questions why the demon lied. Without even waiting, Violet makes it clear that she won't see her colleague in a better light because of something like that. However, Atrox doesn't care about being feared and simply tosses something into Violet's hand, which turns out to be an ointment. That's because the demon claims she doesn't like to live with debts. Then Violet finally starts to think that Atrox might actually be worried about her. Sometime later in that same facility, our hero warms himself with tea by stirring it with his own finger while looking at himself in the mirror. Right after finishing, he places the cup on the saucer until he finds his old leg on the table, making him realize that the girls lied about the dream. At that moment, judging by the girls' faces when he woke up, it was a fact that both protected him. Then he looks at himself and begins to reflect alone in the room. If only he could recover his appearance, Lewis says he would do it no matter the cost. Things would be different. In the end, even though he didn't force anyone, the two girls volunteered to help. However, not wanting to feel guilty, Lewis reaffirms his commitment to regaining his beauty and now realizes how individualistic he has been. At this moment, a scream calling for the hero is heard, so he goes to the window and sees Violet saying that something terrible happened. Sighing in exhaustion, the girl explains that Atrox had a high fever all night and eventually lost control of her power. She transformed into a black dragon, leaving Lewis in disbelief. Obviously, the protagonist runs to help but trips while jumping from the window and falls apart. Anyway, since he's now a skeleton, it's possible for him to run while holding his own head. And when he puts it back, he thinks that turning into a dragon is actually pretty cool. Back to the frantic run, at a certain point, Violet warns that they are almost there. As they get closer, Lewis becomes more and more anxious to see the fantastic form of the Demon Queen. The boy even considers flying around the area using Violet as a mount. Then the hero hopes that she's waiting for his arrival and introduces himself with a very excited smile. However, Atrox's true form was that of a mischievous, bipedal little dragon, and she only caused trouble for a little sandcastle on the ground. Therefore, with all of his expectations shattered, Lewis remained paralyzed. In the Demon King's castle, the lesser monsters couldn't believe what they were seeing, because standing before them was the former Demon Queen, known as the Black Dragon. And with an excited expression, she declared that she had come there to reclaim her throne. Then, with a powerful magic forming in the air, all the subjects tried to run, but it was too late because Atrox cast her magic faster than the demons could escape. At least that's what she thought was happening, since with just a flick to the back of her head, the protagonist knocked the girl out and carried her back as quickly as possible. Faced with this, two bald men were very confused about seeing a skeleton. So since Violet isn't the type to leave witnesses, she handled the job of knocking the humans out. After all that running, later the three managed to reach a safer alley. The protagonist asks if the Demon Queen is awake, and she replies that yes, she is. Quite worried, she asks if she did anything wrong while unconscious, but the hero answers no. Then, unexpectedly, she becomes happy about being humiliated for no reason. In fact, she even starts to think that the protagonist is the best. Anyway, Lewis tells Atrox to get up and immediately asks what happened to her body. Apparently, the queen pushed herself too hard before her body had fully recovered. However, that's something she believes she can't tell the hero because she doesn't want to worry him. Stuffed shamelessly, the girl simply states that she woke up like this. As for being different from a dragon, Atrox also claims that it's actually a good thing, because even if it's not exactly what the hero imagined, she's sure that she will protect him. Lewis, in turn, just holds her by the waist and lifts her up easily while asking if it's really possible to do that in this form. The hero truly appreciates her efforts to recover her body, but believes that Atrox needs to take better care of herself, which leaves her embarrassed. And not stopping there, Lewis makes it clear that the same goes for Violet. For some reason, the protagonist rubs himself against Atrox's cute form, praising how soft she is. Naturally, the girl feels so good, at such a high level that she ends up fainting from shock in the protagonist's hands. And since she gets so hot from embarrassment, the hero lets her go before he burns himself. However, even without strength and lying on the ground, Atrox still gathers her last breath to crawl toward Violet, and smirks mockingly before passing out once and for all, which leaves the human furious. Some time later, after leaving the city, the group passes through a large field. Lewis feels his bones refreshed by the breeze, but asks why they left now when the plan was to leave at night. He questions why they're in such a rush, which leaves the girls cornered. After all, they couldn't reveal that they were being hunted in the village as criminals. Thus, both reply in agreement that they are simply eager to recover the hero's body, and Atrox states that she has already found what she needed in that city. Therefore, although he seems suspicious, the hero runs happily, saying he's one step closer to recovering his appearance. As soon as Lewis walks away, Atrox calls Violet and thanks her for the previous night. After all, there was no way she didn't know what had happened. The night before, when Atrox was losing control and about to go into a frenzy, it was Violet who stopped her. Besides that, she was the one who took care of the queen all night, so there was no way she didn't know. Violet, in turn, asked the girl not to worry about it, as she didn't want to cause unnecessary concern for the hero. In the end, she states that the queen can do whatever she wants to her, as long as it doesn't cause trouble for Lewis. And that's the warning the girl decides to leave for the demon. Without wasting time, the protagonist tells Violet that he smells something delicious nearby. And while the two talk about going to eat, Atrox notices that the girl is quite cold toward her but warm with the hero, which makes her irritated again. A short time later, in a restaurant along the field's path, the three sit at a table. Atrox, for her part, is disappointed that she had to make a lost love doll, a childish item that reduces stress when squeezed. Meanwhile, Violet uses a durable hair bracelet that extends to any size. Meanwhile, our hero receives the single bid necklace and the clothing of shame, which also have good effects. However, he throws everything away, saying it's boring, but luckily Violet manages to catch it. The girl explains that the journey they are about to begin might be more difficult than they think. And from the weather to monsters, demons, and even other humans, everything could interfere. Because of that, Violet said that the item the hero received would definitely help him. Anyway, the protagonist asks where the Demon Queen got all those things. Then, to explain, Atrox says that she was walking around when suddenly she saw something shiny. And then she stole it, which makes Lewis think that this might not be a very acceptable attitude. But regardless, Atrox states that she doesn't care about stealing because demons are bad. And since this is an action to find his beauty, the protagonist goes along with it while Violet watches everything, a little shocked. Shortly after, the three finish eating, and it seems that Lewis enjoyed it quite a lot. However, as they were leaving, an employee called the group and said that they hadn't paid the bill yet. By muscle memory or something like that, Lewis gets very irritated and says that he did them a favor by eating there. For a moment, Violet forgot that the protagonist never paid for food in the past. But to resolve it, the owner of the place showed up, and when he heard from the employee that the customer hadn't paid even after eating so much food, he got angry and concluded that these scoundrels never had money in the first place. Anyway, the night owner Sung called the skeleton, who was our hero, and in case he didn't have money, unexpectedly offered for Lewis to pay with his own body, which after thinking a bit about it, Lewis cheerfully accepted since, in fact, that was his specialty. The moment people heard this, they became worried, thinking the hero had gone crazy. Sung, for his part, admits that the skeleton has confidence and predicts that he won't leave here today. However, as soon as he finishes speaking, Sung himself is thrown into the air in an instant, crashing through the ceiling. And obviously, the one responsible for this is none other than Violet. The employee quickly screams, asking if the boss is okay, but even when trying to wake him up, he seems pretty disoriented. Recapping from the moment he grabbed the skeleton's shoulder, the purple-haired woman rushed in with a punch. However, the fact that the purple-haired woman was the one who did this makes Sung confused, especially because for some reason that makes Violet question the boss knows her name. Regardless of anything, Sung finally manages to remember everything. A few years ago, since his family had been a lineage of knights for generations, Sung dreamed of becoming the strongest man in the world. That was until one day, while walking through a small rural village, he bumped into Violet. Annoyed by this, he grabbed her head, saying that when someone bumps into another person, they should apologize. Whether it was her fault or not, the man didn't seem very friendly to the girl, so she simply taught him a lesson until he begged for mercy. Sung couldn't accept the fact that he lost to a woman, but the most unbelievable thing was that when Louis appeared, Violet immediately turned and apologized. That man who dominated that strong woman with just a word was then the person the knight wanted to look up to. That day, while dreaming of being the strongest, Sung experienced defeat for the first time. But the strong are attracted to the strong, so Sung inevitably fell in love with Lord Louis, and he prepared himself to confess his feelings. On that day, he greeted him and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Then, with a bouquet of flowers, he introduced himself as a holy knight and started saying everything he was interested in. Since Violet was furious about the confession, Louis didn't need to do anything because she quickly scared Sung away. Thus, that day, his attempt to convey his feelings ended in failure. And so time passed until the present moment when he became a head chef. Sung couldn't believe he was seeing Violet again. But it's at that instant that the knight also considers the possibility that the person beside her is Lord Louis. Sung gets confused, wondering why he's wearing a cloak, but considering someone as handsome as Louis, it might make sense. Seeing the strongest man again makes the knight's heart pound like crazy. But at this moment, he is in a weakened state and doesn't want to show this side to the hero. The truth is, the hero wouldn't remember him. But even so, Sung decided to just leave things as they were and told the group to go. After all, he needed to prepare for the lunch rush. Unexpectedly, before returning to the kitchen, a voice says it's happy to see him well. That voice belongs to our hero, who says he was worried about Sung's sudden disappearance. Louis also reveals that he read the letter left in the bouquet and compliments not only the handwriting, but also the knight's cooking skills. In the end, he apologizes for what happened but offers to pay for the meal once Sung resolves his business. Faced with this, the employee screams, asking if the boss is really going to let these crazy people go. And she screams even louder when she notices that Sung isn't paying attention. But suddenly, tears start falling from the knight's eyes, and this escalates into an uncontrollable cry since the strongest still remembers him. The other customers are impressed that the knight used the term strongest to describe another man. But since the hero came hooded along with a beautiful woman, they assume it must be someone important, except for another hooded person who remains silent this whole time. Fast forwarding a bit in time, our group arrives at the city of Frageris, more precisely at the adventurer's exam site, where many are already gathered. At this moment, a voice shouts for a warrior not to block the passage. But even while trying to find this person, he doesn't see anyone, since the one speaking was Atrox in her miniature form. Even so, she still manages to clear the way for the protagonist to pass with a kick. Louis, for his part, informs the reception that he needs to earn money. But instead of participating in the exam, the girls claim that they can get it for him. Thus, the hero asks how exactly they are going to earn it. However, the solution the two give is to beat up humans with the guarantee that it's okay since Atrox is an evil demon. Obviously, the hero gets worried about this illegal suggestion. And in any case, even though he's happy that they're considering doing this for his sake, Louis remembers that they are so broke that they can't even pay for a meal. And when he says that he can't just stand by and let this happen, the girls feel touched. Once again, the hero says that he is there to take the exam and receives instructions. However, both Atrox and Violet manage to see the hero's handsome face for a moment. Because of that, more excited than ever, they decide to register together with Louis. The next day, under heat so intense that even birds are fainting, the physical test of the first adventurer exam is carried out. In the stands, a woman cheers for someone who might be her family. However, Atrox plays a much more excited role, shouting for Louis to exterminate everyone, even though it's just a physical test. From afar, in that place that looks like a desert, the silhouette of the hero appears. And even though it's a difficult path, he keeps running, but also without losing hope that he'll be taken from this life soon. When a specialist analyzes the results of the adventurer exam at the desk, third place goes to a certain man and second place to an irrelevant woman. However, As expected, first place goes to Violet, and last place goes to the protagonist, which causes some people to start mocking him. But to respond, he simply makes a serious expression and shamelessly claims that he was holding back. An hour ago, the examiner for the final test appeared, introducing herself to everyone as Elmin, a ninja elf. And since Elmin was known as the worst examiner possible due to her strictness, everyone was desperate. But anyway, they didn't even have time to worry about it because the elf immediately sent all the complainers flying by throwing some blades, because it was strictly forbidden to talk during the exam. Violet, meanwhile, finds it quite curious that something so thin was able to pierce the ground. Back to the test, the elf announces that it will be a simple task, because the test will basically be the participants trying to survive until time runs out. While Violet and Lewis wait for the event to start, Atrox cheers for her friends. Then a period of silence begins when the protagonist stands in front of the examiner in the arena. He really doesn't know what to say, so Elmin just announces the start of the test. For some reason, she seems curious about something on the boy's clothes, but that was just an excuse to make him bend down so she could attack unnoticed. In this way, as the protagonist falls for her strategy, she gets excited, and when he turns to look, an explosion happens. A warrior, in turn, yells that the examiner should fight fairly. But the elf makes a point of saying that an adventurer must always be on alert, so she asks the next person to step forward. Unexpectedly for her, the protagonist was completely fine after her attack. Because of that, Elmin becomes curious to know how he escaped since she didn't see anything. However, not even the protagonist could explain how he got out of that, so he asked if the girl was sure she had attacked correctly. But what the elf interprets is that Lewis is so arrogant that he judged her attacks as if they were nothing. Unable to endure this disrespect anymore, she states that this time she will give it her all. Then Violet panics and Atrox even more, needing to be restrained so she doesn't intervene. Thus, the elf finishes her move and asks if the boy can now see the difference between the two of them. But the protagonist remains completely clueless and doesn't understand what difference she means. Elmin asks how the protagonist managed to dodge the attacks without even flinching since she was aiming at vital areas. In the end, the reason the examiner's attacks weren't working was surprisingly simple. Elmin is a ninja who fights by targeting blood vessels, but the hero is made entirely of bones. Thus, her attack aimed at pressure points is ineffective against someone who doesn't have any. In the eyes of the elf who doesn't know this fact, Lewis seemed like an opponent beyond her level. In fact, he seemed like a terrifying monster she couldn't even dream of defeating. That's why, after falling to her knees, the examiner's determination returned because in the face of something like this, she couldn't leave without neutralizing the threat. Both Atrox and Violet immediately sensed the girl's bloodlust and screamed for the hero to be careful. In an instant, a huge cloud of smoke appears because of the pressure from an attack, and that pressure is so strong that it sends other participants flying as if they were caught in a hurricane. It seems her eyes are already consumed by power, and fortunately, she is stopped by the protagonist's companions. Anyway, the Demon Queen comments that the elf seems to be acting strangely, and indeed, after being overtaken by a feeling of rage, she suddenly returns to normal without understanding what is happening to her. After Lewis's exam, the examiner was replaced and other participants continued their tests. As a result, Lewis managed to pass in last place, but naturally with the excuse that he was holding back. Both girls congratulate the hero. He says it's nothing special. In any case, Lewis says that he will bring a quest over there, so he leaves the two alone while he goes to fetch it. Thus, Violet enjoys the moment, but only until someone calls her name, saying it's a pleasure to meet her. Suddenly, the guildmaster Paradis named Felton, one of the four greats of the Empire, appears. And based on the girl's performance, he decides to invite her to his guild. But at that moment, another person shows up, saying he's apparently a bit late. This is Solid, the master of the Solidus Guild, which is also one of the four greats of the Empire. And just like his colleague, he wants to invite Violet to his group. Obviously, the two start arguing to decide who arrived first. And the fact that a beginner adventurer is receiving offers from two such big guilds irritates some of the other candidates. Anyway, even the subordinates start fighting, so the leaders ask which of them Violet prefers. But to respond, all the girl asks is whether either of them knows how to return a body to normal, specifically the body of someone who is neither alive nor dead. In this case, the two start thinking but confess they have never heard of such a thing. Therefore, Violet decides to decline the adventurer's offers. If this request cannot be fulfilled, the girl says it makes more sense to simply follow the person she chose to serve. Meanwhile, the protagonist shouts, informing them that he received a new quest. So as the mood of the conversation breaks a bit, Violet quickly says goodbye, and together with Atrox, she runs happily toward our hero. In the end, the adventurers think that the request was simply a creative way to refuse the offer. But even so, they remain curious to know exactly who this man is that holds more value than the two of them. Fulker, for her part, believes that the guy must have a power greater than brute strength, because they themselves have been witnessing it. This girl is a guild leader, and together with Mystic, they form the last two missing from the four greats. Felton, in turn, believes that this kind of power will never appear again. But since they can't be sure, they consider that maybe Louis has somehow returned to life. In the goblin dungeon of the region, several goblins appear scared because standing in front of them is our protagonist. However, what scares them the most obviously isn't him, but rather the monsters he's walking alongside. At this moment, a goblin stronger than the others appears, telling the others to back away. Already very irritated that his subordinates can't handle 3 intruders, the goblin king Wei asks who the hero is to invade their territory. But the moment he pays a little more attention, the two seem to recognize each other. When the protagonist first woke up as a skeleton, this was one of the goblins he encountered. Therefore, our hero starts trembling, making Violet worried. Then, thinking this is a cowardly act, Wei mocks him, asking if the skeleton remembers the good old days. But before he even finishes speaking, he gets hit in the face with a powerful blow from a wooden club. It's so strong that not only does it break the weapon, but it also sends the king flying through the air. In the end, instead of being afraid like last time, Lewis makes a point of saying that he's grateful to be able to meet this bastard again. The goblins watch what's happening in front of them, unable to believe it. Meanwhile, Aatrox seems excited, and Violet is extremely focused. That's because Wei, who was supposed to be the strongest among the goblins, is getting beaten unilaterally. And even as he begs Lewis to stop, the hero continues without any mercy, just as they did to him. After some time venting all the suffering he endured in the past, the king falls to the ground, completely defeated. Therefore, Wei wonders in his mind whether this damn skeleton is really the same one he knew, because for some reason he seems very different from before. Struggling to get up, Wei asks whether the protagonist isn't afraid of him. After all, in his opinion, fear should be deeply engraved in Lewis's memory. But the answer Wei receives is a piece of wood thrown at his head. And to compliment it, the hero says he has no reason to fear a small fry like him. To explain better, Lewis tells the goblin to look behind him. There are 2 people who are thousands of times scarier than Wei, so there is absolutely no reason to be afraid. Furthermore, Lewis states that he is no longer the same skeleton that Wei used to beat up. In this case, the king shouts, saying that Lewis is being very arrogant just because he has support. However, the 2 girls he's talking about react with terrifying expressions. And this makes Wei realize that even though he's angry, he needs to hold himself back to survive. Thus, Wei makes a very friendly wave and admits his defeat with a smile. But our hero interrupts this strange declaration from the monster, and picks up a club again, saying he's not going to let the goblin go just because he's trying to act friendly. So he warns that it's not over yet and tells the monster to get ready. He also makes it clear that if he tries to escape, his bones will be broken. After that, later, the group makes a toast with good drinks. Both girls praise the hero's good work. Lewis, in turn, comments that if there's anything else they want, they can feel free to ask. So Violet asks if the hero is sure, and he replies yes. To explain, Violet said she was talking about the goblin who was left alive and might want revenge. And thinking about something like that made the protagonist seriously consider the matter. Since that goblin had once hurt the protagonist, they went back the next day to finish him off. Then Wei begged with all his strength to stay alive, saying he would be the hero's loyal dog. Thus, Lewis analyzed how much Wei wanted to live and got a little lost in thought. Since he had already gotten his revenge, our hero said it was fine because he had also received his reward. And when asking Violet's opinion on the matter, she proudly agreed. Sometime later, at dinner time, Aatrox sticks a piece of meat and tries to offer it to the protagonist's mouth. But just as she's about to do it, a piece of food is stolen by Violet, who judged the demon's action as rude, because to her, doing something that could annoy the protagonist is very bad. Aatrox gets irritated and says that Violet is making it difficult to do anything around there. So the girl grips her fork more firmly, and as Violet keeps annoying her, the queen asks if she wants to die. In response, Violet holds a knife and states that she will say it only once for Aatrox to sit down and not do anything that irritates Lewis. Since he knows them very well, Lewis really gets irritated that the two are arguing. So Violet quickly returns to normal, offering him a drink, and Aatrox wastes no time doing the same. This leads the two to compete once again for a place with Lewis. Violet yells for Aatrox to stop, but the demon says the same back to her. So inevitably, the girls start fighting while Lewis drinks at the table. From another counter, a guy asks if he should go there to stop the mess, but a colleague says it's normal for drunk people to fight. Besides, by the sound of it, the bald guy can tell they are fighting over a man. Since Violet is pure with a pretty smile and Aatrox also seems quite cute, and considering they are fighting over this guy who's drinking alone without caring, the only conclusion the bald guy can draw is that this is the confidence of someone who has everything. Even so, the guild master of the Lonely Sky, named Mosul, gets a little irritated. Sometime later, still in this tavern, most of the food plates are already empty, and our hero, who has already had a lot of fun, thinks he should order another drink since they've run out. But it's at this moment that the guys from the Lonely Sky Guild see a chance to talk to Lewis and tell him to leave. However, being under the influence of alcohol, the boy asks what they mean by "I'm nothing." Obviously, the adventurers interpret this sentence as if the hero was insulting them as irrelevant. So one subordinate breaks a bottle over Lewis's head, and for some reason, Lewis thinks the hero is talking about the leader's baldness. That's why Lewis falls to the ground, feeling a bit of pain in his head. But he also smiles, saying that the guys seem to be better than he expected. After the hit, the protagonist gets up a little and asks if the ugly bald guy in front of him doesn't know how to take care of kids properly. Both the word ugly and the word bald cause a huge impact on the subordinates. That's because it was a sensitive subject for Mosul, since they were in an era of hair loss. Thus, now that the insult was intentional, the bald guy orders his goons to beat Lewis until he can't take it anymore. However, all the protagonist does is laugh at the situation. Then he asks, still laughing, if the girls heard what the guys just said. But when he realizes, he's surprised because, unfortunately for him, both were practically asleep from drinking. Therefore, with no one to defend Lewis, the subordinates did exactly what they said they would. The next morning, Violet and Atrox, who somehow managed to get to their room, began to wake up and both their heads were still spinning. Given that, the hero asks if they are already awake. Then Atrox asks what happened earlier and the boy explains that he brought them back when they fell asleep. So both apologize for causing trouble and the protagonist says it's okay. But when he removes his hood to call them to eat, his face is covered in bruises, to the girls' surprise. Obviously, the girls panic, wanting to know what happened to the protagonist. And since it's very embarrassing to admit that the great Lewis got beaten up at the bar, it claims he simply tripped over something in the street. Therefore, he also changes the subject, asking them to take a bath so they can eat. Violet, however, is sure that it's not just an injury from a fall. And at that moment, Atrox releases an energy explosion, returning to her original form. She believes Lewis is hiding the truth, trying not to reveal who hurt him. However, even in that horrible situation, she manages to remember that at some point an order was given to drive the protagonist away. For the demon, it becomes clear that the culprits are the guys from yesterday. And obviously, she was out to take revenge for everything they did to her love. Violet, in turn, remembers that she told them not to do anything against the protagonist. Then Atrox questions how the girl can say that after seeing him in that state. Violet actually replies that she will also go with the demon, especially because anyone who hurts the protagonist deserves a punishment, so they can never do something like that for the rest of their lives. And this is definitely something the Queen strongly agrees with. Sometime later, at the refuge of the Lonely Sky Guild, located at the top of a mountain, a guy seems quite bored since they have a very noisy prisoner. Anyway, the same guy warns that they have visitors, so the boss asks them to come back later. However, knowing Mosul, the subordinate informs that it was a pretty girl, and because of that, they let the protagonist's two partners in. The boss, in turn, remembers that this is the girl who was with the weak guy from the day before. So he asks how she found this place and compliments the fact that she brought a pretty friend along. Anyway, Mosul approaches with his knife, asking if the two are there for revenge, and if they are worried about the weakling. He suggests that guys like them are way better than those types. In that case, Violet gently touches the adventurer's hand and asks if it was with that hand that he hit the hero. Then, a bit foolishly embarrassed, he answers confirming. Thus, Violet understands and, with just one movement, simply sends the arm that did it flying. The movement is so fast that for a moment the bald man doesn't understand, and he only starts to feel pain after falling to the ground, which makes the subordinates panic. Violet explains that if the guy had tried to pick the flower, she would punish the hand, and if he tried to step on it, she would punish the foot. Therefore, with a terrifying expression, she asks how the adventurer intends to damage her flower. Trembling with fear, Mosul calls his subordinates to attack Violet. And even though they are also scared, they charge, hoping they can do something. Meanwhile, the protagonist stops at the dining hall to eat. And even now, he complains about the pain, not understanding why they hit his face when he told them not to. Anyway, at that moment, Atrox enters the place, announcing that she is back. The protagonist asks where she went, then the girl replies that she brought something that can make money, and she asks this thing to say hi to the protagonist. Lewis, in turn, asks who this chubby uncle is. Then the man gets furious and yells, asking if the boy knows who he is. However, because of this shout, Atrox gets even more irritated and states that if he doesn't want to die, he better calm down, which the man understands. Anyway, the hero just asks the two to come eat soon. And if the chubby guy is also hungry, Lewis invites him too. Of course, the man refuses because he was called that, but his stomach growls and inevitably he decides to set his ego aside. Thus, the four start eating with a very friendly atmosphere. However, at a certain moment, the man wonders what is going on there. Those who kidnapped him were not weaklings, so dealing with them without injuries was something incredible. Furthermore, the girls didn't seem like the type who would follow someone, since they had completely different personalities. But regardless of that, somehow now the two were sitting at the table like good girls. Controlling them with money and power must be impossible, so taking this fact into account, the man believes there must be only one option. To the hero's surprise, the man bows at the table and introduces himself by the name of Dilek. The man explains that he was the lord of the village of Rebelum until recently, and he also states that there is no possibility of anything being under that cloak other than incredible beauty. Dilek explains that being attentive to details is what made him a lord, and he already expected he was right. So believing he is speaking to Lewis, the man says that he likes him, and he comments that he has a daughter with enough beauty to inspire a line of suitors. Therefore, what Dilek asks is whether Lewis would consider marrying her. But what's truly surprising is that Lewis accepts right away, which obviously leaves both Violet and Atrox speechless. Before anything else, Dilek warns that there is a condition for allowing the marriage. and to explain himself, he says that marrying a princess is not that simple. However, upon hearing this, the protagonist says he no longer wants to get married. Naturally, the man panics and asks why, since his daughter is incredibly beautiful. Then the hero replies that he's too busy to discuss conditions and knows that every daughter is beautiful in her father's eyes. Dilek cannot believe the boy is refusing to marry just because he's busy. So deciding to use a more direct approach, he asks if the protagonist is looking for something. This makes the hero ask how the man knows that, so it is said once again that a lord needs to be observant. Anyway, Dilek admits that he doesn't know what the boy is looking for, but he guarantees he will help him. Still, since the lord doesn't even know what the protagonist wants, it will be difficult. However, if the hero is just searching for something he lost, Dilek believes it's a waste of time. And because of that, he simply asks the boy to save the village of Rebelin for him, because if he does, he will receive a great treasure. Sometime later in the mountain region, a cart passes by guided by a man with his horse, and inside all four who were eating together can be seen. First, Dilek asks about Atrox's cute appearance since the goal is to save the village. However, if the man is so eager, the queen suggests that he attack her to see what she's capable of. Changing the subject, Violet says she will accept the protagonist's decision but questions how Dilek will help them, making it clear that if he's lying, he will be in serious trouble, which makes him tremble a bit, even as a lord. Dilek starts explaining about the treasure and asks the girl to put the knife down. The man explains that to help find the treasure, there was a map, and that his ancestors, tired of war, dreamed of a peaceful life. Thus, through this same map, they discovered the village of Rebelin during an expedition. It was a place that wouldn't be submerged even in the case of a flood, and with good sunlight and wind through farming, they achieved great abundance. For a long time, the village was surrounded by rocks, so it was easy to prepare against enemy attacks. That was until this peaceful village started being threatened by that guy. Naturally, the protagonist asks who this person is, and Dilek explains that it's someone who sees human lives as insects. But fortunately, the man can take the hero, since he thought marrying his daughter to him would protect the village. However, at that moment, the two girls threaten him since it becomes clear that Dilek was trying to manipulate Lewis. Saying he had no choice while being attacked, the Lord shouts that the village is his most precious place, and precious enough to make him marry his daughter to a man he just met. Therefore, after hearing his sincerity, the protagonist asks the Lord not to worry, because as long as he can find what he needs, he will do everything in his power. Thus, after more time traveling, the group arrives at the village of Rebelin. Once there, the first thing they do is get something to eat, and since it's very good, they all agree he had a bit more. So they continue walking as if they were on vacation, and the Lord, who was left behind after getting tired of chasing them, feels a bit disappointed because they are fooling around. However, he decides to go along with the mood and relax a little too. As they walk, someone comments about some commotion involving the princess. Akali, who is a merchant, mentions that the festival was made with the purpose of marrying off the princess. Therefore, the first guy comments that the future of the village seems bright. However, the fact was that the princess had standards so high that no one could reach them. Several men had already confessed to her, but all were rejected because of their appearance. Anyway, the current prince is tall and handsome, so both hope everything will go well. In this case, the hero hopes the princess doesn't have the same face as her father, but Dilek assures him that he was also handsome when he was young. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by someone who bumps into two others. And by continuing to run, he soon crashes into the lord of the city as well, causing them both to fall to the ground. Given that, the protagonist offers to help the man up, which he accepts. As for the other guy, he aggressively refuses help from his subordinates. This is the prince of the kingdom of Eumilis called Siborum. The reason he was like that, however, was because he had been rejected and the rumors were already spreading among the citizens. Siborum, who had always heard compliments about his beauty, was called ugly. So to vent his anger, he grabbed Dilek by the neck, questioning why he bumped into him. Fortunately, the protagonist shows up to defend the lord. And since it was the prince who bumped into them first, he tells him to apologize, calling him an ugly bastard. For someone unknown to them to lay hands on the prince, the subordinates draw their weapons. However, this time the girls from the hero's group are alert and with their meat skewers subdue the guards. Siborum had never been called ugly twice in a single day. Therefore, feeling humiliated and with an abnormal amount of rage, he grabbed his weapon to finish off Lewis. But at that moment, someone threw a shoe that hit the guy's face right away, making him fall to the ground unconscious, to the despair of his subordinates. Shortly after, someone breaks the silence by commenting that they were bothered by the rejection and came out to see how Siborum was doing. However, the princess of Rebelin named Cecily did not expect that the prince of Eumilis was intimidating her father. The fact that the princess refers to her father reveals to everyone's surprise that the lord is back. Then Siborum gets confused, wondering if he is really his future father-in-law. But right when he says that, the princess gets irritated, because although they hadn't realized it, when he was rejected, the guy grabbed Dilek by the collar and threatened to kill him. Obviously, Siborum tries to explain, saying it was a misunderstanding. But in response, the girl asks if his father, who is still in the kingdom, will believe that. Anyway, for the sake of the prince's image, she says she will keep this a secret, but only if Siborum returns immediately to the kingdom he came from. Sometime later in the castle of Rebelum, the princess yells, asking what happened to her father, especially because despite how it doesn't seem, he lost so much weight that she almost didn't recognize him. Knowing Dilek, the girl truly gets quite sentimental. The Lord, in turn, says that he cannot give all the details, but the girl understands that he has his reasons. By the way, Dilek says he has someone he would like to introduce to Cecily. The name of this person is Louis, someone even the Lord recognizes as handsome, and who was also almost the man she married not long ago. Logically, the girl asks what her father is talking about, but since the hero already refused, he asks her not to worry. Cecily, in turn, gets irritated, so Dilek asks her not to take it personally. While the girls in Louis's group boil with anger, Cecily thinks about a reason her father proposed the marriage since she knows his preferences. Therefore, she wonders if the protagonist might be the man of her dreams. Changing the subject, her father asks if Louis regrets not getting married now that he has met the princess. Then the hero thinks for a while, causing great anticipation. But soon he replies that he didn't like her that much since she looks too much like the Lord to the joy of the others. Perhaps for the first time, Cecily feels what it's like to be rejected so directly. She says the protagonist is smart and believing that he refused strategically at first. She asks Louis to take off the cloak. After all, if he really is handsome, the two could get married. Louis doesn't like being pressured and reaffirms that he has no interest in her, so he asks not to be bothered. Calling her father ugly and speaking informally with the princess is enough to make her irritated. So the girl orders her subordinates to take down this guy. But all of this was still part of her strategy to make the protagonist take off his cloak, which unfortunately for her didn't work since in an instant the two guards she sent were slammed into the wall. Alongside Atrox, Violet states that the princess won't be able to touch Louis and the hero agrees. Since the two guards she sent were the best in the village, Cecily feels a little intimidated. And to make it worse, the girl's father yells, asking what she thinks she's doing. Dilek is very disappointed that his daughter treated the guest he brought so badly. And to make it clear, he apologizes directly to the protagonist, who accepts without any problem. As the guests seem startled, the Lord announces that they will call it a day for now. And quite humiliated, the princess leaves along with her guards. However, before passing through the door, the girl at least congratulates her father for returning home safely. Then she goes away and Dilek quickly puts his hands on his face, which makes Louis ask what's wrong. Despite how it looks, the man quickly stands up, saying he's completely fine. In the end, before the protagonist leaves, there's a place he must visit. So since he has to do that, he suggests the boy take a look around the village, which having nothing else to do, the hero naturally accepts. The next day, everyone notices that the weather is great. Besides that, the protagonist's mood is really good since the skewer is delicious. That's why he asks why he's being followed by the princess like a fly in soup. Since she is a princess, Louis really wants to know if she doesn't have anything better to do. Then, after thinking for a moment, the girl remembers that the hero could be the man of her dreams. And because of that, she holds back a little, saying she's doing this because he might be a dangerous person. In this case, the protagonist tells her to feel free as long as she keeps her distance. Therefore, the girl gets irritated and asks if the boy really sees her as a fly chasing soup. However, her foot hits a rock on the ground and losing her balance, she naturally starts to fall. Luckily for her, Cecily falls for the protagonist like in a romantic movie. But instead of catching her, what our hero does is step aside, letting her fall to the ground. And instead of asking if she's okay, Louis reminds her of what he said about keeping their distance. Already pretty annoyed with everything, Cecily asks if that's what you say to someone who just fell. Then the hero places a cloth on the girl's bleeding nose and explains that this is why he told her not to follow him. To the protagonist, the girl is way too clumsy for an adult, so he leaves the handkerchief with her. And once again asks her to stop following him because it's already getting annoying. At the end of that conversation, the guards ask if the princess is okay. But all she could think about was how until now, every man she met was fake and full of pretension, only showing their most polished side. On the other hand, despite the protagonist's rude way, his unfiltered behavior was definitely something that was making Cecily more and more curious. That's why she didn't listen to the boy's advice and decided to continue following the group shortly after. Given the whole scene in the center, the citizens were outraged to know the identity of the man in the cloak who spoke so casually with the princess. At a certain moment, one of them thought of a good reason for Cecily to be following him. Then he quickly decided to share his conclusion with the others. The princess has always been someone obsessed with handsome men to a ridiculous level. So for her to be following someone this much could only mean that the guy under the cloak was an immensely handsome man. Naturally, as time passes, night falls, and back in her room at the castle, the princess complains a lot about not being able to see Louis under the cloak even after following him all day, especially because she remains curious to know if the boy is really handsome. To kill her curiosity, Cecily asks her maid about the rumors regarding the hero, and for the sake of her ego, she hopes that he is someone ugly. However, what the maid reports is that according to the rumors, Louis is actually an incredibly handsome man. After hearing that, the princess recalls that everywhere she went, people followed her. But at a certain moment, even the citizens started to recognize the hero. And for the rumors to be so strong that they reached the ears of the princess, her heart beats faster than ever. because for the first time, Cecily believes she will meet someone truly handsome. Meanwhile, from somewhere, our hero feels his ear itch and concludes that someone must be talking about him. The next morning, everyone gets worried because there is only one skewer left, so the stall vendor has to apologize to his customers. Lewis, in turn, asks if someone happened to buy before them, since the first thing they did upon waking up was come straight there. Still a bit hesitant, the vendor decides to explain. It was a fact that despite everything, the group had already eaten many skewers, but for some reason recently, the cockatrices hadn't appeared around the village as they usually did. In this case, the hero suggests catching some for the vendor, but he desperately refuses, asking if Lewis is trying to die. It is said that normally these monsters are hunted using traps, and that one of them alive is dangerous since they can release poisonous gas on other people. Therefore, while offering the last skewer, the vendor just asks the boy to wait a little longer, because he guarantees that if they are lucky, they will be able to catch one as early as the next day. Lewis seems very thoughtful about everything that was said, and to the vendor's surprise, he states that hearing that only made him even more eager to capture the monster. After all, if the stored skewers are this good, Lewis is excited to try a freshly grilled one. And despite the vendor's warnings, this is how the group sets off on yet another dangerous adventure, which makes the princess, who watches everything from afar with a soldier, practically forced to follow them. Sometime later, already in the evening, the hero's group walks through a rocky field while being followed by Cecily. The princess's guards want to know exactly where the cockatrice is because they truly believe there's none there. On the other hand, the hero also can't see anything, but Violet says they are in the right place. Suddenly, the voice of a knight is heard, suggesting that everyone should return to the village now since it's already getting late. This is the captain of the Knights of Rebellum, named Harbing. Since the princess is also participating in this expedition, the captain comments that it will become dangerous as night falls. But despite Harbing's advice, the protagonist states that he will not go back. Furthermore, he questions why they are being followed in the first place, saying that if they're just going to be annoying, they should leave. The princess in turn tells Harbing that it's fine. However, the knight didn't want to put up with such disrespect and therefore drew his sword to finish the protagonist with an attack. At least that's what he would do in theory, but at the last second, Harbing stopped. Since the boy didn't move even a millimeter, the knight asked if Lewis noticed that he wasn't actually going to hit him. And just the wind from Harbing's movement makes the trees around them get cut. However, the truth was that Lewis hadn't noticed anything and was actually panicking. Anyway, Harbing comments that he heard about the protagonist defeating some of his men while he was away. He says that he spared Lewis out of the mercy of the knights and advises him to act respectfully toward the princess from now on. He also makes it clear that the next time there is disrespect, he will die. But before Harbing even noticed, suddenly the two girls from the hero's group had subdued him. Violet says she has held back a lot until now and asks if the knight is testing her limits. It all started with a marriage proposal for Lord Lewis from Diluk. But when the boy was introduced to Cecily, that same princess tried to kill him. And now even Harbing, who was the leader of the knights, dared to point his sword at Lewis. That's why, although Violet really wanted to cut them all down, the knight's punishment is a well-placed kick from Aatrox to the face, done by the mercy of the flowers. As for the rest, Violet grabs her sword and slashes the ground, creating a terrifying gust of wind. Thus, she warns the princess that no one has the right to treat the hero with disrespect, and that flowers should only be admired with the eyes, which made it clear that this was a kind of threat rather than a simple request, scaring Cecily quite a bit. Having said that, the girls return to check on the protagonist, leaving the princess alone. Quickly, Harbing stabs his sword into the ground with conviction and asks for orders from Her Majesty. At first, the princess doesn't understand what this is about. Then Harbing explains that insulting her means insulting the entire kingdom of Rebellum. Therefore, all Harbing asks for is a command from his superior. A command so they could fight for her honor to the death. Suddenly, the sound of a slap echoes throughout the forest. Harbing didn't know why, but he had just been slapped by Her Majesty. With tears in her eyes, Cecily vented that if the knight talked about dying one more time, she would do it with her own hands. The princess was trembling because she didn't want to have done that, so Harbing managed to understand the girl's feelings and apologized. Back to the hero's point of view, he says he's fine but asks why Violet didn't protect him from the start. Aatrox in turn comments that she trusts Lewis' abilities, which leaves him confused. Despite the protagonist looking as weak as a useless skeleton, the girl reminds him that he has super regeneration powers. So logically, Lewis gets furious but does nothing because he knows he will lose. Anyway, the hero simply calls the two to get back to searching until the ground starts shaking like in an earthquake. A little farther away, the guards scream to prepare for battle and Harbing takes care of the princess. Knowing it was already too late, Violet draws her weapon, and so the group waits for the noise to reveal itself from the forest. First, smaller animals start coming out, almost driving the protagonist with them. A royal guard is confused about this, but his partner yells for him to stay alert, especially because suddenly a giant gorilla appears just as desperate as the others. When Lewis was already prepared to run, Aatrox asked him to look closely. That gorilla, which seemed to be the biggest threat, was crying. And from inside the forest, a huge but precise tongue shot out like a whip until it reached the monster, piercing it like a skewer. It was now clear that the group had found the delicious animal they were looking for, but no one there expected that the appearance of a cockatrice could be so intimidating. Despite the monster itself being scary, something else caught the soldiers' attention. That's because, along with the first one, there were others just as frightening. Cockatrices had always been known for the clear trait of being solitary monsters, so it made no sense at all for there to be so many of them sharing the same space. Acting almost on instinct, Harbin shouts to protect the princess, and being the strongest guard, he faces the first one on the front lines. Quickly, the attack comes, and the knight leader manages to defend, but with a lot of effort. So the princess asks if Harbing's okay. Regardless of his condition, the knight states that he won't let the monster take another step toward the princess. He adjusts his posture to perform his secret technique, which is his trump card. And at the moment the monster approaches, the technique that the knight calls the beautiful sword swing comes into play. The monster roars, trying to intimidate his opponent, but the knight screams back with even more determination. Thus, Harbin comes out victorious, managing to strike the beast first. As soon as the monster falls to the ground, all the soldiers charge to take advantage of the chance. Then the cockatrice sees its entire life flash before its eyes. Some time ago, this monster was born into a good cockatrice family. Soon it grew up, becoming young and, like every young one, full of vigor. At a certain moment in its life, luck smiled on it, blessing it with a good partner whom it loved more than anything in the world. Everything went well until one special day the monster decided to propose marriage to its companion. But for some reason, the mutant chicken that was its soulmate until now refused. The cockatrice collapsed on the ground in tears, wanting to know why it was being rejected. During all that time, the two had already gone hunting together and even shared worms. But what its ex said that day was that the old boyfriend didn't pay attention. Because she had already said many times that she was allergic to worms and exhausted, she left him crying by the seaside. All these memories came back as the soldiers' swords approached. So the monster started to have an existential crisis and the guards attacked mercilessly, which made them very excited for being able to defeat a cockatrice. With enthusiasm, they shouted that the princess could now rest easy, making Harbin proud to the point of drawing Lewis' attention to show how powerful the Knights of Rebelum are. However, on the hero's side, all the others in the flock had already been defeated, so Harbin had to admit that Lewis's group was made up of monsters. Now the next stop would be the village, but the defeated monster suddenly resurfaced, and from behind the princess, released a dense cloud of poison. The gas made it impossible to see ahead for the knight captain. And if it was already difficult for someone so well trained, for Cecily, who accidentally inhaled a bit, it was even worse. However, just as she was about to faint, the feet of a skeleton crossed the fog, and Lewis's hands covered Cecily's breathing while he gently asked about the girl's well-being. Going straight toward the beast in front, the protagonist calls out to the monster. He questions why it attacked the princess from behind like a coward, princess who is useless, weak, and nothing but trouble. Lewis says they call her a princess, but all she does is waste food, which makes Cecily increasingly uncomfortable. However, stating that even monsters should have common sense, the hero questions who allowed it to act so irresponsibly and whether the beast thinks the world revolves around it. This was a delicate point since it was exactly what its ex said when she left it. The stress level of that cockatrice went beyond any limit, and crying, it charged forward, saying that humans could never understand it. While running, all the monster could think was that no one could understand its love. But as soon as its energy completely faded, it finally collapsed, defeated. The guards quickly checked and confirmed that the monster had stopped breathing. So understanding this as his own failure, the knight couldn't grasp how Lewis knew that the beast was already at its final breath. Furthermore, to control such strength, he believes that maybe this level of composure might be normal for someone like him. But now Harbin is also curious to know what kind of power someone like Lewis has. While the hero was splashing a bit of water on his face, Cecily appears, asking what he wants. For some reason, the princess doesn't understand Lewis had thrown himself into the toxic gas to save her. And now, thinking about it, the protagonist doesn't know why he wasn't affected. Anyway, Cecily continues and says that because of Lewis's deeds, she will guarantee whatever he wants. But the protagonist just replies by calling her rude. After all, when someone saves your life, you should say thank you, not ask what the person wants. So Lewis asks the rude princess to listen carefully. From now on, to her surprise, he asks her to stay out of his business. And so the group leaves, taking the monsters while Lewis says that's what he wants. After a few seconds, Cecily screams, claiming that she never said she was interested in him. Very irritated by all that confidence, she asks Harbin if she looks like someone interested in that lunatic. And she complains, saying she is the most beautiful woman in the world and isn't interested in anyone, while the knight just enjoys the scene. Back in the village, because of the protagonist's massive haul, the dinner meal is served in abundance. Dilek is one of those who takes the opportunity to eat a lot. But the girls from the hero's group tell him to stop making weird noises because it ruins their appetite. Given that, Cecily's father questions the protagonist, who is eating much more desperately. But obviously, for these women in love, any mistake Lewis makes is actually a success. Back to important matters, the hero asks where Dilek has been all this time since he said he would be out briefly. Then the former lord says he went through hard times and after struggling a bit, thanks our hero, because it's thanks to him that the village is as happy as it is now. And more than that, Dilek thanks Lewis for saving the life of his daughter, who is the one he cares about most. Since he's that grateful, the protagonist asks to receive the map. But Dilek says that Lewis already has it, which makes him a bit annoyed, interpreting that the old man won't hand it over. To explain, the former lord tries to make it clearer what the map is, but the hero starts talking to the girls about the food. So in the end, Dilek gives up trying to talk to the protagonist, believing it to be a waste of time. While the banquet is happening inside the village, outside, a man calls for his lord, and he announces that he has made sure to prepare that as requested. Thus, this lord named Slim calls his subordinates to head straight to the village of Rebelin, which he claims is his rightful place.